Hello friends! Visual novel ramblings is what I've decided to label these types of videos. Here I'll basically roll over any discussion topics or concepts that I thought would be interesting to talk about. I also play footage from visual novels I have played before in the background with labels on what games they're from, so if any catch your eye or look interesting, you want to know more about them, you can tell me down in the comments. A quick disclaimer, the opinions presented here will be just that, opinions. Feel free to disagree with them or perhaps explain your own opinion down below. For the first topic, I thought it would be best if we get down to basics here, which you probably noticed if you check the title of the video. Hopefully this will help you understand a good chunk of what I plan on covering in this channel, as perhaps some of you may be confused as to why I covered Rance Quest, when at first glance it seems like just an RPG like any other. And that question is, what is a visual novel? A simple question really, yet one with many different answers depending on who you ask. And the person I plan on consulting is the guru of the internet, the one that knows all, and by that I mean Wikipedia. A visual novel is an interactive game genre which originated in Japan, featuring text-based story with narrative style of literature and interactivity aided by static or sprite-based visuals, most often using anime-style art or occasionally live-action stills and sometimes video footage. So basically, a Japanese choose-your-own-adventure book is what it's saying, which is a fair, if very mechanical description for the medium. Below that, there's this talk about how Japan sometimes separates NVLs and ADVs, with ADVs having gameplay, NVLs not having gameplay. But honestly, I think nowadays, Japan just puts everything under the adventure game symbol. I mean, Steins Gate Zero by Nitro Plus came out around 2 years ago, and that's considered a science fiction adventure game, even though all the interactivity the player has is in making choices. Overseas, however, the international audience would place both of these types of games under the same moniker, visual novel, which is probably why the VNDB or Visual Novel Database page contains games from Higurashi to Professor Layton vs Phoenix Wright, all the way to things like Kamidori Alchemy Meister. While all these contains varying levels of story reading and gameplay, they are all considered visual novels under VNDB. For the most part, my personal consideration of whether a game is a visual novel or not is whether at least a solid 50% of the game is spent reading dialogue, whether it be between characters or inner monologues. Which is why I consider something like, say, Sengoku Rance a visual novel, even though it still has a lot of strategic elements and is very heavy on the gameplay. But I wouldn't consider something like, say, Silent Hill 2 to be a visual novel, even though it's a game with a lot of story emphasis. The main difference to me is how the story is presented, and how much reading the game puts forth as their primary way to tell the story. With all that said, I'll follow the general international strategy that if it's on VNDB, it's pretty fair game for me to cover, and even games outside of that might be included. With all that said, let's dial it back a little right now. Rather than a definition, what comes to your mind when you hear the words visual novel? I imagine, for the vast majority of the listeners, especially for those who've only read maybe one or none at all, the first thing you probably think of is a Bishoujo or Otome game. The ones where you play as a relatively faceless guy or girl, as if you're a witness to a criminal act under protection of some sort. You go to a high school or cafe or magic academy. You meet a group of inexplicably cute or handsome members of the opposite gender. From there you make a bunch of choices, you throw a random beach scene in there halfway through, you raise relationship points, and then at the end you maybe get an intimate scene with your chosen member and get a happy ending or something like that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this sort of visual novel isn't so prevalent when it comes to both the international and Japanese markets. Just look at the popularity of memes like Nekopara, or way worse, the Sakura games, which are pretty much bottom tier effort garbage that are 3 hours long, yet somehow still make me feel like I wasted my time. Nor do I think that these types of visual novels have no place in the medium. After all, every VN must offer some sort of value to their intended audience. Although the aforementioned Sakura games on Steam make me question this thought every day. That said, I firmly believe that visual novels are also comprised of stories that are much more than just dating anime women and men, or for getting your rocks off. Animes like the hugely popular Steins Gate and Clannad all started as visual novels before being adapted to anime, and those are all incredible stories. Actually, Clannad would be considered as kind of basic school love Bishoujo game I mentioned earlier, and it's still considered among the best. I would go even as far as to say that these stories are far more enjoyable and deeper as visual novels than in their more accessible adaptation forms like manga or anime. Visual novels have some of the best horror stories like Higurashi When They Cry, mysteries like Ever 17, science fiction like the previously mentioned Steins Gate, modern fantasy with Fate Stay Night, mechas with Soko Aki Muramasa, cyberpunk with Baldur's Sky, school life with Little Busters, and well, I think you get my point. Even in terms of being games, The visual novel Rance X is one of the best games I ever played, with a hilarious character interactions and a tough as nails difficulty that doesn't coddle you. Phoenix Wright is a great adventure visual novel that has achieved widespread appeal, and Utawareru Mono, the Two Hakoro, which I think is a far better title than The Mask of Truth, is a solid Fire Emblem-like visual novel with great music and characters. None of these visual novels are just made to date cute anime girls, and none of them are just made to get off once or twice to. These visual novels represent some of the best stories I've ever had the pleasure of sitting through, and I mean that in comparison to books, video games, manga, and anime. As for what makes visual novels so great, well, I've got a few ideas to share about that matter. I believe visual novels are great since they have the freedom to be written by the creators without the jurisdiction of overseeing of any major companies like any other normal console game or anime. If characters have some sort of trauma, some sort of psychological reaction to someone or something, the authors are free to explore it without angering any bigwigs or getting stopped by anyone higher up. Very similar to the indie game scene in America. If they have a crazy idea they want to present in their story, they are free to do so without anyone pressuring them to appeal to a wider or different audience. With an emphasis on reading and storytelling, visual novels are free to delve deeper into a character's thoughts, motivations, and goals without being restricted to any sort of time constraint like an anime or manga has. A scene that would be like a quick 5-second line in an anime or a single page in a manga would instead be a couple of paragraphs exploring the character's psyche in a visual novel. I can safely say that the best character interactions I've ever seen have come from playing VNs. At the same time, visual novels have a presentation and budget that elevate it from being like an OC work on some sort of fanfiction website. The sense of suspense you get as you click through a gruesome descriptions with the background being some sort of stale, inorganic white wall, accompanied by a startling lack of music, or even worse, clown music as you click on, is something unique to the medium. It's just that fine line of how much control the player is given versus what the game is trying to show. Just like a good book, visual novels can use a lot of tricks in what it does and does not show to beguile and surprise the readers, with the added ability to hint at scenes with images and animations. Aside from the creative freedom visual novels tend to have, there's also the emphasis on characters and stories that you just don't see as much in other games, who need to prioritize gameplay as a selling point and story secondary in order to appeal to the audience they are directed towards. Which is not to say I always think story is more important than gameplay. I myself enjoy a fun game like anyone else, like Dark Souls or Divinity 2, but it's always nice to have a change of pace. Even with visual novels that contain gameplay, you can always tell that the narrative is the primary focus, while perhaps the opposite holds true in other types of games. Although, to be fair, sometimes visual novels take this too far, with gameplay are basically an afterthought, but that'll be a video for another day. So I've spent the past few minutes talking about visual novels in quite a positive light, and the fact that I'm a big fan of the medium is probably quite apparent. That said, I want to give a broad overview of visual novels in general, and that includes the negatives. Visual novels in the end are exactly what they sound like. Games that are focused on presenting the stories in a way akin to a novel. That is to say, they involve reading a lot of text. VNs aren't the type of game where you can expect to start blowing up things from the introduction. By this same logic, another weakness of visual novels are that the beginnings tend to be pretty slow. Unlike other games which can hook you in with a bombastic action set piece, visual novels usually spend their time building up character backgrounds and history, relationships to each other, and all that sort of thing. While some visual novels introduce these in a fantastic way that immediately hooks the readers, the vast majority will be a much more slower affair, which some may find adequate at best and dull and plodding at worst. The Utawareru Mono sequel, Ituwari no Kamen and Futari no Hakoro, is a great example of that. As a whole package, I think the two games are fantastic. As a standalone product, man was the first game's first half of 20 hours incredibly boring. Another inconvenience about visual novels is that they are lower budget products in general. I said earlier that visual novel development is very similar to indie game development in America, and I meant that not just in the creative freedom aspect, but also in how much money they have to work with. Visual novels tend to be relatively jank affairs, especially when they have gameplay and resort to 3D. Since they don't have anywhere near the budget of AAA games of, say, Dark Souls, you have to cut corners in places, and sometimes those cuts can be fairly obvious. It's why when I see a visual novel with a wide range of varied sprites for each character, I'm very impressed rather than thinking it's expected. Of course, in the end, it's up to the company to how well it uses their budget. For instance, Rance X has some of the best gameplay I've ever seen and looks amazing while it's at it. Consequently, Rance 9 has some of the jankiest looking gameplay I've ever seen. Last one off the top of my head is that, while visual novels are a medium that allows the writers to flex their brains and writing muscles, sometimes they can go a little too hard, whether it be because they really want to push a point home, think that what they're writing is super genius, or it's just straight up bad writing. Visual novels live and die by the writer's ability to make good prose, and when you're churning out like 30 hours worth of text to sift through, chances are not everything you write is going to be solid gold. I've read my fair share of bad text, and even some of the most well-known visual novels by the community at large, like Fate Stay Night, has less than stellar lines and paragraphs in it. With only nice art, voices, and gameplay if lucky to belly the experience, the writing is what is presented first and foremost to the audience, whether that be to its game's advantage or to its detriment. Let's finally bring it all back together to the original question. What is a visual novel? A visual novel is a narrative-focused game that presents a story primarily through written dialogue. Although they are generally perceived as just dating games to bed cute anime characters, they are more like well-made reading experiences made by indie companies that have creative freedoms in their story to explore whatever topic they want. The stories in visual novels range just as much as they do in anime, from those lighthearted for making people feel warm and fuzzy, to those much darker in tone and tackling far harder subjects. While they may lack budget or have slower beginnings compared to other video games, they make up for with intricate plots and thoroughly explored characters, and I believe that the stories in visual novels are some of the best I've read in any medium. If any of that sounds good to you, stick around to the channel. I'll be introducing some of the better visual novels I have played throughout my time in this medium. I'll be keeping it wide and broad as I present those from various genres and gameplay, and I hope you'll find the one that you will pick up and thoroughly enjoy. If any of the visual novels I listed look cool to you, or you'd like to share your own opinion on what a visual novel is, feel free to comment down below if you want to hear me talk about it. As always, if you like or dislike the video, the buttons are down below, and if you would like to stay up to date when I talk about the other visual novels, or just support me, hit the subscribe button. With that, I'll see you next time. I'd say next week, but I failed that when I had to scrap the project that wasn't going well, so next time it is.